I'm Thibaud. My pronouns are he, him. I'm super happy to be here. I was initially hoping to in 2020, like quite a lot of you, I'm sure. And it's honestly amazing to finally be there in person, touch the stage, see the people in person is so much nicer in my opinion. Honestly, big kudos to the organizers for making this happen over the last few years, but definitely even better for them to follow through and make that happen here in Porto, as was the plan. So I'm Thibaud. I'm a developer working at Torchbox in the UK. I work on Wagtail, which is CMS based on Django, as well as also contributing to Django's own accessibility team. And today I'm here to talk about my take on UI development within Django projects. You might not think of Django as something of a UI framework, but definitely there's plenty of people who spend a lot of their day in Django templates in particular, and I'm actually pretty happy to go through that. And we'll look at some of the tools we put together to, I guess, make this simpler. Quick word from our sponsors. My colleague Sage was here earlier today as well, saying that Torchbox, our employer, is hiring. He's already said that. I just wanted to mention that we do work with pretty cool people in the public sector and non-profit space, as well as people who sponsor our CMS Wagtail. So yeah, very much open to remote applications as well. So component-driven development, it feels like quite a big term, but it's really not that complex. It's essentially the idea of creating small components, one after the other, starting with the simplest ones, then gradually over time increasing complexity by combining those components until you actually arrive at pages. So if you think of a CMS like Wagtail, the whole point of the CMS is to help you create pages. There's definitely plenty of commonality between the different pages that you have on the site. So it would be a bit pointless to try and reinvent each and every page in isolation. Instead, we basically create small parts of the page and then decide how we combine them into the actual page level templates. So not really anything too new, but I think it's interesting nonetheless to have this as a term, to compare this as a methodology with things like test-driven development. Obviously, when you talk about UI development, it can be quite hard for you to test what you're producing in any other way than visually. So it's important to have those methodologies in there, even if what you do is visual testing. And yeah, it's definitely nothing super new either. People who have done quite a bit of front-end development might have heard of atomic design in the past. It was a very similar idea of combining small atoms into larger and larger components and then eventually creating pages. I have a small illustration here with the Instagram UI. So to the left, you can see the tiny atoms, the icons, the buttons, and so on. Then gradually you combine those into the actual view that end users look at. And yes, so React as well is well worth mentioning because to me that's the one framework on the UI side of full stack development that brought components as one of the foundational pieces of how we structure our projects. I won't go too deep into React, but basically there are three things in particular that I personally find invaluable that it might not have brought to the table, but it definitely popularized quite a bit. Thing number one, reusable components as the one API you create your apps from. Number two, the UI developer tools. The React dev tools that we have in the browser are some of the most advanced, or at least they definitely were some of the most advanced in front-end frameworks world back when it was introduced. And UI testing tools as well, as part of continuous integration, were very much a new thing in the front-end world with React. And lastly, is kind of following through from the other two, but this idea that from then on with frameworks like React, you can think of each unit of UI code as something that you can actually write unit tests for, so very traditional input, output. And yeah, we can definitely have the same things for Django. And definitely that's the goal here. I want to bring some of those capabilities to Django projects. Before we look at how we do that, I feel like it's interesting to further make the case that we do want those things in Django. We don't just want Django to be compatible with some of those frameworks, So the chart we're looking at here took me quite a while to put together, but it's there. The data is there. The big line that's green, or yeah, kind of brownish. The big one, that's Django, and that's Django's performance as far as the core web vitals scores, which are free metrics introduced by Google. That's Django's performance over time compared to some of the other frameworks in this space. So, took the same ones as Sage had mentioned this morning. So basically, the further up, the better. And we can see that Django is quite well placed, but definitely, depending on the tool you use, you will get different results. Obviously, the scores there are the median scores, so it just gives you a sense of, like, statistically, what you're likely to achieve with a given framework, but it doesn't constrain you necessarily, if at all, on if you actually invest the time, how good of a score you can get, or on the contrary, how bad of a score you can get. So performance, a very clear example of the impact of any one technology's UI capabilities for end users. And accessibility as well, something that's very close to my heart. So now we're looking at the median Lighthouse accessibility scores for, again, those 4 same frameworks. We can see that the average across, the median across all frameworks that this tracks is at 83 points, and Django is right about there, and definitely other tools based on what they provide score better or worse. Flask is at 71 points as an example, so definitely Flask, something that has no opinions about front-end at all, scores quite bad, which kind of makes sense. Django, in my opinion, there's definitely no reason for it to not score as well as more recent tools like Remix. So that's why we want this to be happening in Django and not just compatible with Django with other tools. And in my journey through this, the way I tried to bring this through Django is via my work with Wagtail, which is our open source CMS that's based on Django. With Wagtail, we're essentially creating administration UI for people's websites that has to be quite advanced, and at the same time, very heavily customizable by people who are familiar with Django. So it's quite hard to reconcile those two things, and that's why we needed pretty advanced tooling, at least in my opinion. So just as a point of reference, this is the Wagtail main page editing interface as of a year and a half ago, and this is the same interface as of today. So obviously, if you haven't spent time with Wagtail yourself, you might not see each and every one of the changes here, but you can definitely see that there's been quite a lot happening over time for us to refine this user experience. And that's why we need tools like Django to have support for those methodologies, because when you start to push Django towards its limits on the UI side, you do need more help. And one key term I haven't mentioned here with this component-driven development is design systems. So it might be a term you're familiar with from the UI and design world as well. This idea that you first, as an organization, define all of your components in isolation, and then you will be able to replicate that across many different platforms. So that's what we went through with Wagtail, and here we're looking at all of our shades of buttons. And that's essentially it for the main part of the presentation, and now I'll spend as much time as I can get away with on demos of all those tools, and hopefully give you a bit more of a backstory on how they work behind the scenes. So I haven't mentioned Storybook yet, which is definitely in the title of my talk. We'll look at that shortly. I forgot to mention, by the way, all the slides here are available online right away, so it's at torchbox.com/2022-components if you want to have a look at the links and so on at the same time. So we'll start our demo quite simply by looking at Wagtail's design system again. And I'm now looking at our Figma. Yeah, we do quite like Figma, at least for now. I'll leave it at that. it solved quite a few problems for us. Definitely makes it super easy to view each and every one of the millions of different components and their variations we have in Wagtail's design systems. And then essentially my job as a UI developer is to translate each and every one of these into something that looks more or less the same, and also we can maintain that many of them in code, which is definitely a challenge, particularly for an open source project. Hence why, again, the tools that I'm talking about today are, in my opinion, quite warranted. So that's just a bird's eye view. Now I'll move into my personal favorite view of this, which is my spreadsheet, where I track all of my lovely components, 83 of them. I track where they are used, and I also track their states of, I guess, updatedness, like how maintainable they are and so on. And that's, again, something that really there's no reason why this has to live in a spreadsheet. We could just have better development tools that factor in these types of considerations. Knowing in Django, for example, where a template include might be used, that's very valuable information and would definitely be great for Django templates to have support for those types of use cases. And yeah, now we look at the actual tool. So it's a package called Storybook Django, very clever, I know, that combines both. We're looking at the Storybook UI right now. For people who might not have seen Storybook before, it's coming primarily from the React world initially, and then gained for support for all of the other modern JavaScript frameworks. So you can preview all of your UI components in isolation and test their different states. So not actually realized, but what we're looking at right now is a preview of a React component. And then side by side next to it, I have the preview of my Django components. And really, at least from the UI, you can't really tell what they are built with, which is the whole point. You shouldn't need to care at this point in time when looking at this, what a given component is built with. The whole point of a tool like this is to, again, make it much easier to maintain many components, but also that you can put this into the hands of designers, people who are stakeholders, and just want to look at, oh, this specific variation of that component. Do we have it already? Do we need to change the lots based on our recent specification changes, things like that? And it's not just a static demo that you can navigate. You can actually interact with the fields at the bottom here to change each and every one of the little bits of information that are displayed on the page. So here I'm changing the CTA label at the very bottom of my info box component. And again, that's exactly what we tried to bring to Django. So I might actually demo a simpler component for this, my quote block component, which is just a Django template. And this as well, I can edit just as much as I want. And I have plenty of other interesting goodies in here as a UI developer. So I can change the background that sits behind each of the components. I can also change the viewport size. I can configure this based on my project's agreed upon screen sizes that we test with, which is very helpful. And I can also run tests, which is where this, to me, really starts to shine. It's definitely useful to have a repository of everything you have to visually test like this, but it's even better if you can actually automate some of that testing and take some of the pain away from manual, like cross-browser, making sure this looks right before, after any design changes. So automated tests I have in there. I have accessibility tests for all of my components, and that's both in the browser, in this UI, but also something I can run in continuous integration. So just by virtue of having structured my components like these, I can actually run a test suite across the 80 or so components I have in there and check that none of them have any accessibility issues across all of the different states I have defined test cases for in here. So for example, here I can run a test based on whether the quote has an attribution at the bottom or not. Not super relevant here, obviously, but you get my point. I also have step-by-step interaction tests in there. Well, maybe I don't. I look for them at some other points, but essentially many different forms of testing, and one that I want to demo a bit more than the rest is visual regression testing. So here I'm switching back to my terminal, and at the very bottom, you can see I've made 2 changes to my Storybook Django project, and it's just to install this library called Percy that has built-in support for Storybook. Percy is a pretty cool visual regression testing tool, and all I have to do if I already use Storybook is basically tell Percy where my Storybook is hosted, which right now is locally, run that one command, and again, Percy is going to go through all of those Storybook stories, one by one, regardless of what they are built with, and take screenshots of them, compare them against the baseline version. So again, you can imagine that if I was doing this by hand, it would be very time-consuming, and it's definitely much, much, much better that I can do this on like literally every build that touches our CI pipeline, and essentially have much more confidence. And if I'm honest, have much more confidence for UI things in particular is quite valuable. I feel like in the Django world, definitely people are familiar with unit testing of backend logic, but UI still is not as mature in lots of cases. So I'm looking at the Percy UI now. I won't spend too much time on there, but just to show you that it does actually work. So in this case, it took 40 screenshots of all of my component variations, and I can scroll through them. And again, the idea being that if I had made some UI changes, I would see them in this kind of view. And this is made possible by having the structured component library. Now I felt like it would be interesting for us to look at an actual demo of how you make those types of changes and an actual template. So if I look at how this code is structured in my IDE, I can see this stories file. That's where my Storybook metadata about the component and where all of my test cases are defined for this one component. The template itself is basically just a vanilla Django template, no surprises there. You'll notice that I took the liberty of putting the components JavaScript and style sheets and documentation all in the same templates folder. Not sure how people feel about this, but to me at least it's quite cool. Yeah, some of my colleagues I feel like find this quite stressful to look at, but yeah, make of it what you want. And then, yeah, so essentially, all I do in my Storybook example for this is load my specific HTML template, then tell it to render with my Storybook Django library, and then configure the different test scenarios for it by providing different context data. So context, just the Django views rendering context, nothing too fancy here. I can actually also override the tags from Django, the template tags, which is quite helpful if I don't want to have to mock up the whole of the context that I need for a given component. And we'll look at a very simple component straight from Wagtail, which is our help block for my next example. So I'll just make sure I'm OK with time and switch over to the correct view in here. Yeah, so that's my help block. My help block is a very simple component. It just has kind of this theme based on its status. I can see the status at the very bottom. I can edit this just as much as I want. I think the predefined ones are critical. Warning. I can also check what happens without a status. You probably shouldn't shift like that when it doesn't have one, but I'll raise the bug for that later. And what's actually really cool about this component is something I haven't mentioned at all, which is that with this component we managed to solve one of the big issues we have with Django templates. So I'll switch over to an example of where we use this component so you can see what I mean. So you'll notice this isn't just include help block.html. Instead of that, I'm using this special template tag called help block just after the name of the template and end help block. I think I can probably already see what is going on here, which is that whatever is between those two tags gets rendered inside the help block. If you spend more than a month or so in UI development, this feels like very, very basic functionality that Django itself actually doesn't have. The only way to pass HTML around components like this in Django is via inheritance with the extends tag and blocks. There is no way to include a component with arbitrary HTML, and there is no way to include a component with arbitrary template inside the contents of that component. And you could see that here, if I wanted to translate this line right there with my trans tag, well, I'd have no way to do that with vanilla Django templates. So this is exactly the type of problem we run into, and I think ought to be addressed much closer to Django core than per project. And the good news is there's plenty of people who have solved those problems, one of whom being my colleague, Mitch. So I didn't do any of this, he did. Thank you, Mitch. Mitch created those template tags that allow us to go through more, I want to say advanced, but really it's quite fundamental patterns of UI development. So he's created those tags that start with a hash sign and a slash for the end tag that make it easy to include arbitrary content within a given component. And there are lots of libraries that do this, not just Sleepers, but definitely I would recommend trying this out if you had the chance to see what they look like in practice. The hash and the slash, that might put you off a bit. There's actually another way to do this that is much simpler, and we'll switch to my last demo to look at what this other way is. So one of the things I built a couple of hours ago for this talk was this Django templates live preview that is built upon PyScript, which I'm sure you've heard of. So this is actually running Django and Django templates in the browser. So I'll now load Django in there, and we'll get to see what this template tag that Mitch put together does. It does take quite a bit of time to load. It's about 30 megabytes, so just you can access this on your computer, on your phone, but you've been warned. Don't go through your roaming allowance. So yeah, I can make changes in there. It's just a very straightforward code editor, and there's no backend request here. It's just all in the browser, thanks to PyScript and the project it's built upon called Pyodide. And I can completely change this template. I'm the boss here, really. And same from your side. You can definitely play with this and try out different variations of the templates. And yeah, the one variation I really want everyone here to try is this fragment template tag that Mitch has introduced. So I'll first switch to, I guess, an example of how I would have done this in the past. I have my button HTML include. That's completely vanilla Django template here. I give it 2 props / attributes / parameters, which is label, and what's that? Tell you what, there's actually one other thing that really annoys me with Django templates, is that all has to be in a single line like this. I feel like I have to spend quite a bit of time on this because I've heard it mentioned as a feature of the language in the past, that it forces you to move back to the Python and simplify things in the template, but yeah. If you're a UI developer, a button HTML element can easily have a class name, an ID, 2 or 3 area attributes, and there's really no reason for those not to be able to fit into multiple lines if they can in HTML. So that's my rant / feature request. Multi-line template tags. Anyway, so, yes, sorry. That's how you do it with vanilla Django. And with Mitch's template tag, we can introduce this fragment, which means I don't have to change my actual component so far here. I can still include my button. This exact same line here at the bottom, even though we can't see some of it for some reason. And the one thing that has changed is where this my label comes from. If I look at my previous example with vanilla Django, my label was called button label and came from a variable assignment to this translate tag output. That's very important if I want my button label to be translated. And there is no other way to do it in Django than like this, or completely move the label to the Python, which is a bit silly. And what Mitch allows me to do is to actually create this temporary variable that contains arbitrary template syntax and HTML. So here I'm combining the output of translate with another icon component. And you can see how this can get essentially as complex as you need it to be based on what you want to build. So it might not be a case for a button to have 2 labels and an icon in the middle like this, obviously, but sometimes there is, and it's important to have this kind of flexibility in the base language, again, in my opinion. And that's me. This is ready to play, live, online, just costs 30 megabytes of data, so do be careful with your roaming allowance. Storybook Django as well is a library we've open sourced quite a few months ago now, and that we do use to actually implement Wagtail, so it's definitely quite well tested. And I'd love to work on any of this or anything else related to UI development with anyone who'll be there at the sprints. Thanks very much.